Millionaire CEO never touched a woman until me. Now he claimed he's passionately addicted. Hi everyone, a very warm welcome to all of you. I'm so glad you're here today because I have something truly special to share with you. Honestly, I'm beyond excited to tell you this story. It's really close to my heart. Trust me, you don't want to miss this one. Just sit back, relax, and let yourself feel the deep love and passion between two souls. This is going to be a masterpiece, I promise you that. So please stay with me till the end. You'll thank me later. And hey, if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more beautiful stories like this. All right, enough talking. Let's dive into the magic together. Matt Henry was the epitome of success, a self-made millionaire whose name commanded respect and influence in the corporate world. His rise to the top was nothing short of extraordinary, built on years of relentless hard work, strategic brilliance, and an unwavering focus on his business empire. He had mastered the art of negotiation, outsmarted competitors, and built a financial empire that stretched across industries. His cold demeanor and calculated mind made him nearly untouchable in the business world. But behind the closed doors of his luxurious penthouse, Matt Henry was a man harboring a secret that no one would have believed. Despite his wealth, power, and the endless line of women eager to be on his arm, Matt had never touched a woman before. It wasn't because he couldn't, it was because he chose not to. Rumors swirled around his personal life. Some whispered that he was too cold, too emotionally detached to care about romance, while others speculated that he was secretly uninterested in women altogether. But Matt knew the truth. He was waiting for the right one. His standards were impossibly high, and he refused to settle for anything less than perfection. He didn't want meaningless flings or shallow connections. He wanted a woman who would make him feel alive, someone who would awaken a part of him that had been buried beneath years of emotional detachment and business-focused ambition. He had resigned himself to the idea that such a woman might never come along until his parents arranged a marriage with Malino. At first, Matt resisted the idea of an arranged marriage. It felt archaic, outdated, and beneath him. But then he saw her. The first time Matt laid eyes on Malino, it was as if the world tilted on its axis. She was breathtaking. Her smooth brown skin glowed under the soft lighting of the grand ballroom where they were introduced, her long, stylish braids cascading over her bare shoulders like liquid silk. Her eyes, wide, deep, and mesmerizing, held a quiet strength that cut through him like a knife. Matt wasn't a man easily impressed by appearances, but Malino was more than just beautiful. She was magnetic. Her gaze met his with a calm intensity that made his chest tighten. Her perfectly sculpted brows arched delicately over her captivating eyes, giving her an air of quiet elegance and mystery. She carried herself with effortless grace, her slender figure wrapped in a sleek, champagne-colored dress that hugged her curves without being overly revealing. Matt found himself unable to look away. When she smiled at him, soft and knowing, it stirred something deep within him that he had long believed was unreachable. His parents had spoken highly of Malino's character, her kindness, her intelligence, her warmth, but none of their words could have prepared him for the raw, visceral reaction he had when she stood before him. His heart was racing, his palms slightly damp, a foreign sensation for a man who had spent his life mastering control over every emotion. When he took her hand for the first time, her skin was soft, her fingers delicate yet strong as they curled slightly against his palm. A current of energy pulsed through him, making his pulse hammer in his ears. Matt Henry, the man who had faced hostile boardrooms, ruthless competitors, and high-stakes business deals without so much as a flicker of emotion, found himself completely unarmed in the presence of this woman. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with a mixture of curiosity and warmth. "It's nice to meet you, Matt," she said, her voice soft and smooth, carrying the faintest hint of amusement, as if she could sense how much she had already affected him. Matt's throat tightened. He forced himself to smile, a real smile, not the calculated expression he used to charm clients. "It's nice to meet you too, Malino," he replied, his voice low and rough. As the evening went on, Matt couldn't stop looking at her. He watched the way her lips curled when she smiled, how her eyes sparkled when she laughed. She was confident without being arrogant, graceful without being forced. There was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself, and Matt found himself drawn to it like a moth to a flame. When they danced, his hand resting lightly against the curve of her waist, Matt realized he had never felt so acutely aware of another person's presence. Her scent, a delicate mix of jasmine and vanilla, wrapped around him, making his chest tighten. His fingers flexed slightly against her waist, and when her hand slid up his arm, Matt's breath hitched. He wasn't sure how long they danced, but when the music stopped and she pulled back to look at him, Matt knew with chilling certainty that nothing in his life would ever be the same. He had built his life around control, controlling his emotions, his business, his future. But Malino had slipped through his defenses effortlessly. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, Matt couldn't stop thinking about her. The softness of her hand in his, the warmth of her smile, the way her eyes seemed to look straight into his soul. He had been prepared to resist this marriage, to approach it as a business transaction. But now all he could think about was when he would see her again. His mind was consumed by thoughts of her, how her skin would feel beneath his fingertips, how her lips would taste beneath his. He had never touched a woman before, not because he couldn't, but because he had been waiting for someone like Malino. And now that he had found her, he knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same again. The grand cathedral was bathed in soft golden light, the towering stained glass windows casting shimmering hues of red, blue, and green across the marble floor. Rows of elegantly dressed guests sat in hushed anticipation, the atmosphere thick with a quiet reverence that made every sound, the distant hum of the organ, the soft rustling of silk dresses, the occasional murmur of whispered excitement, feel heightened, almost sacred. Matt Henry stood at the altar, his tall, broad frame rigid in an impeccably tailored black tuxedo. The crisp white shirt beneath the jacket contrasted sharply with the dark fabric, the diamond cufflinks on his wrists catching the light each time his hands twitched nervously at his sides. His face, usually composed and unreadable, betrayed a flicker of vulnerability as he exhaled slowly, struggling to calm the fierce pounding of his heart. His entire life had been about control, controlling his business, his emotions, his future. But at that moment, standing there beneath the vaulted ceilings of the cathedral, Matt felt dangerously close to losing control. His steel-gray eyes, sharp and calculating, were fixed on the double doors at the end of the aisle, and then they opened. The shift in the atmosphere was almost palpable, a collective intake of breath from the guests, the sudden hush as every pair of eyes turned toward the entrance. And there she was, Malino, a vision of perfection. She stood framed by the massive oak doors, a single ray of sunlight illuminating her like a spotlight. Her wedding gown, crafted from the finest silk and lace, clung to her slender figure in all the right places, the fitted bodice accentuating the soft curve of her waist, the flowing skirt trailing behind her in a cascade of shimmering white. The delicate lace sleeves framed her smooth brown shoulders, and the plunging neckline revealed just enough of her collarbone to make Matt's mouth go dry. Her skin, flawless and radiant, glowed beneath the soft light, her long braided hair cascading down her back like a crown of dark silk. Tiny pearls and crystals had been woven through the braids, catching the light as she moved. But it was her face that stole Matt's breath. Wide, deep eyes framed by thick lashes and sculpted brows, her gaze was soft yet piercing, looking straight at him with a quiet confidence that made his pulse hammer violently in his chest. Her full lips curved into a gentle smile, and Matt felt a sharp pang in his chest, a sensation he had never known before. His hands curled into fists at his sides as she began walking toward him, each step slow and deliberate, the sound of her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, echoing through the vast space. Her father held her arm, but Melino's gaze never wavered from Matt's. His heart raced wildly, each beat a frantic drum against his ribcage as she moved closer. The distance between them narrowed, and Matt realized with sudden clarity that this woman, this stunning, magnetic, breathtaking woman, was about to become his wife. He had never wanted anything in his life, not wealth, not success, not power, as much as he wanted Melino in that moment. His mind raced with thoughts he could barely control, how her skin would feel beneath his fingertips, how her lips would taste when he finally kissed her, how her body would respond when he touched her for the first time. And yet, beneath the hunger was something deeper, something raw and terrifying. He wasn't just drawn to her beauty. He was drawn to the quiet strength in her gaze, the warmth in her smile, the effortless way she seemed to slip past his carefully constructed walls without even trying. His throat tightened painfully as she stopped before him, her father's hand sliding away from her arm as Matt extended his own. Her fingers were warm and delicate as they curled against his palm, and Matt nearly shivered at the contact. His thumb brushed over the soft curve of her knuckles, and Melino smiled up at him, her eyes sparkling beneath the veil that framed her face. The priest began speaking, his voice echoing through the cathedral. But Matt barely heard him. His entire world had narrowed to the woman standing before him, the rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, the faint scent of jasmine and vanilla that clung to her skin, the slight trembling of her hand in his. He couldn't stop looking at her. When the priest asked him to repeat the vows, Matt's voice was low and rough, thick with emotion he couldn't conceal. "I, Matt Henry, take you, Melino, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. Her gaze softened, and Matt felt his chest constrict painfully as he slipped the delicate diamond ring onto her slender finger. Melino's lips parted slightly as she spoke her vows, her voice smooth and unwavering, and when she slid the matching band onto his finger, Matt's breath hitched. His entire body hummed with tension as the priest declared them husband and wife. "You may now kiss the bride." For a single, breathless moment, Matt hesitated. His hands slid up to cradle Melino's face, his thumbs brushing over her smooth cheeks. Her gaze held his, steady and unwavering, her breath warm against his mouth as he leaned in. And then he kissed her. Her lips were soft and warm beneath his, the taste of her sweet and intoxicating. A low growl of satisfaction rumbled in his throat as her hands slid up his chest, her fingers curling into the lapels of his jacket. The kiss deepened, and Matt's heart pounded violently as his arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer until her body was flush against his. A quiet gasp escaped her lips as Matt's hands splayed against the small of her back, his need for her suddenly raw and overwhelming. When he finally pulled away, breathless, his forehead resting against hers, Melino's eyes were wide and dark with emotion. "I love you," Matt whispered hoarsely, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone. Melino smiled, her lips curving beneath his. "I know," she whispered back. Matt's chest tightened painfully as his arms tightened around her waist. He pressed another kiss to her temple, his mouth lingering there as applause erupted around them. But Matt heard none of it. All he could hear was the soft sound of Melino's breathing, the quiet thud of his own heart against his ribcage. As he led her down the aisle, his hand never leaving hers, Matt knew with terrifying certainty that his life would never be the same. He wasn't just marrying Melino, he was surrendering to her completely. And for the first time in his life, Matt Henry welcomed the loss of control. The honeymoon suite was bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, the flickering flames casting golden shadows across the walls and ceiling. The air was thick with the intoxicating scent of roses and jasmine, the faint hum of city lights beneath the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, adding to the hushed intimacy of the room. Matt Henry's heart hammered violently in his chest as he closed the heavy mahogany door behind them, the soft click of the lock echoing unnervingly loud in his ears. His hand lingered on the doorknob for a moment before he forced himself to turn toward Melino, his breath catching at the sight of her standing near the edge of the massive king-sized bed. She was breathtaking. Her long, braided hair cascaded down her back, the delicate pearls woven through each braid shimmering beneath the low light. She wore a delicate slip of white lace that clung to her slender frame, the thin straps slipping over her smooth brown shoulders and highlighting the soft curves of her collarbone. The hem of the slip skimmed the tops of her thighs, revealing a tempting hint of her toned legs beneath. Her wide, dark eyes met his with quiet intensity, her perfectly sculpted brows arching slightly as she watched him with a mixture of curiosity and warmth. Matt's mouth went dry, his fingers twitching at his sides as heat coiled low in his abdomen. He had faced boardrooms full of ruthless investors, negotiated billion-dollar deals with men twice his age, and built an empire from nothing. But standing before his wife in that moment, he felt like a terrified boy. His pulse roared in his ears as he took a hesitant step toward her, his gaze dropping to the soft curve of her lips as she smiled faintly. "Melino," he murmured, his voice low and rough. He didn't know what he was asking for. Permission, reassurance, maybe even forgiveness for the hesitation burning through his veins. But Melino understood. She stepped toward him slowly, the lace slip shifting with each movement, the soft rustle of fabric against her skin, making Matt's breath stutter. "I've never done this before," he confessed, his voice thick with vulnerability. His hands curled into fists at his sides, his jaw tightening as he forced himself to meet her gaze. "I've never touched a woman before." Melino's smile softened, her eyes warming with quiet understanding as she closed the distance between them. Her hand lifted to his face, her slender fingers brushing over the sharp angle of his jaw before sliding to his lips. Her touch was light but sure, her thumb tracing the soft curve of his lower lip with deliberate tenderness. Matt's breath hitched, his entire body going rigid beneath her touch. "Then let's discover it together," she whispered, her breath warm against his mouth. Matt's control shattered. His hands moved before he could stop himself, sliding to her waist as he pulled her against him. The thin lace of her slip was almost sheer beneath his fingertips, and the warmth of her skin burned through the fragile barrier of fabric. Melino's breath hitched as his hands slid down to the small of her back, his fingers splaying wide over the delicate curve of her spine. His head dipped toward her shoulder, his lips grazing the soft skin there as a low growl of desire rumbled in his chest. Melino shivered beneath his touch, her arms sliding up to wrap around his neck as she pressed closer. Matt's heart pounded painfully as his lips trailed from her shoulder to the hollow of her throat, his mouth lingering there as he breathed her in. Her scent, soft jasmine and honey, wrapped around him, fueling the hunger tightening in his chest. His hands slid upward, skimming over the gentle curve of her ribs before settling just beneath her shoulders. "Melino," he rasped, his voice raw with need. She lifted her head, her eyes dark and luminous as they met his. Slowly, deliberately, she slid her hands down the lapels of his tuxedo jacket, pushing the expensive fabric from his shoulders. Matt's breathing quickened as the jacket hit the floor with a soft thud. Her fingers moved to the buttons of his shirt, her hands steady as she undid each one with careful precision. The cool air brushed over his bare chest as she pushed the shirt from his body, her eyes darkening as her fingers skimmed over the hard planes of muscle beneath. Matt's hands trembled as he touched her face, his thumb brushing over the smooth curve of her cheekbone. He leaned in, his lips barely grazing hers as his breath shuddered. "Tell me to stop," he whispered. Malino's eyes darkened, her lips parting as she slid her hands over his bare chest. "Don't stop," she whispered back. That was all Matt needed. His mouth crashed against hers, the kiss deep and consuming. Malino's lips were soft and warm beneath his, her hands tangling in his hair as he backed her toward the bed. His hands slid down her back, gripping the soft curve of her hips as he laid her down against the mattress. Her slip rode up her thighs as she arched beneath him, her breath catching as Matt's mouth trailed down the line of her jaw to the hollow of her throat. His hands trembled as he touched her bare skin, the heat of her body burning through him like wildfire. "God, Malino," he whispered, his lips brushing over her collarbone. She shivered beneath him, her hands sliding down his back as he pressed closer. His mouth found hers again, the kiss growing deeper, more desperate as the last of his restraint slipped away. Malino's arms tightened around his neck, her breath hitching as his hands slid beneath the slip, his fingers splaying over the soft skin of her back. He pulled away just enough to look into her eyes, his breath ragged as he brushed his thumb over her swollen lips. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Malino's gaze softened, her hand sliding to his face as she smiled. "I want this. I want you." Matt's chest tightened painfully at her words, his heart hammering violently as he leaned down and kissed her again. His hands slid down her body, memorizing every curve, every soft, breathless sound she made beneath him. Her slip slid from her body as Matt's mouth explored every inch of her skin, his hands learning the delicate lines of her figure with reverent precision. Malino's breath hitched as his lips trailed down her throat, his hands sliding beneath her thighs as he pulled her closer. His control snapped completely as she whispered his name, her voice soft and breathless against his ear. "Matt." His name on her lips sent a shudder through him, and Matt knew with terrifying certainty that he would never be the same. He had touched perfection. He had tasted heaven. And now he was completely and utterly addicted to his wife. Matt's hand hovered in the space between them, his breath ragged as he stood frozen before her. The soft glow of the dimmed bedroom lights bathed Malino's smooth brown skin in a golden hue, making her look almost otherworldly. Her long braided hair cascaded down her back, the delicate pearls woven through the braids shimmering like tiny stars under the light. Her wide, dark eyes watched him with a quiet vulnerability that made Matt's chest tighten painfully. His fingers trembled as they lingered just inches from her skin, hovering near the curve of her jaw. Malino stood still beneath his gaze, her breathing soft and shallow, the slight rise and fall of her chest making Matt's heart hammer violently. His pulse roared in his ears as his eyes traced the delicate slope of her collarbone, the thin lace slip she wore doing nothing to hide the soft curves of her figure beneath. His breath hitched as he finally forced his hand to move, his fingertips brushing over the silken curve of her cheek. A bolt of electricity shot through him at the first contact, his entire body going rigid as his thumb slid across her warm skin. Malino's breath hitched, her lips parting slightly as Matt's thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with aching tenderness. He swallowed hard, his throat tight as his other hand lifted to frame her face, his palms cradling her jaw with reverent care. His hands were large compared to the delicate lines of her face, and his chest squeezed painfully at the realization of how fragile she felt beneath his touch. He leaned down, his forehead pressing against hers as his breath mingled with hers in the narrow space between them. "Malino," he whispered, his voice rough with need and vulnerability. She lifted her gaze, her dark eyes locking with his, as her hands slid up his chest, her fingers curling over the hard muscle beneath his thin shirt. "Matt," she whispered back, her voice soft and full of quiet trust. That was all it took to shatter the last thread of his restraint. His mouth found hers, the kiss soft at first, hesitant as though he was afraid she might pull away. But Melino's hands slid up to his neck, her fingers threading through his dark hair as she kissed him back with quiet intensity. A low growl rumbled in Matt's chest as his arms tightened around her, pulling her closer until their bodies were pressed together. His hands slid down from her face, tracing the delicate line of her neck and skimming over her bare shoulders. Melino's skin was impossibly soft beneath his fingertips, her warmth sinking into his bones and making his pulse throb painfully. His hands slid lower, brushing over the curve of her waist and down to her hips as he deepened the kiss. Melino sighed into his mouth, her breath hitching as Matt's hands tightened against her hips. His heart hammered wildly as he lifted her slightly, his hands splaying over the small of her back as he backed her toward the bed. Her legs hit the edge of the mattress, and Matt pulled away just enough to look into her eyes. His breathing was ragged, his dark eyes burning with raw intensity as his thumb brushed over her swollen lower lip. "You're perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with awe and hunger. Melino smiled, her hands sliding over his shoulders as she pulled him down with her onto the bed. Matt's breath caught as her long legs slid over his, her warmth seeping through the thin barrier of fabric between them. His hands trembled as they slid beneath the hem of her lace slip, his fingertips brushing over the smooth skin of her thighs. Melino's breath hitched, her nails digging into his back as Matt's mouth found the hollow of her throat. He pressed soft, open-mouthed kisses against her skin, his breath hot and ragged as his hands slid higher, memorizing the shape of her beneath his hands. Melino arched beneath him, her head falling back against the pillows as Matt's mouth trailed lower, his hands sliding up her sides to frame her ribs. His breath hitched as his thumbs brushed over the gentle swell of her chest beneath the thin lace, and his head spun with the need building low in his abdomen. "Matt," Melino whispered, her voice breathless and trembling. Matt's head lifted, his dark eyes meeting hers with raw vulnerability. "I've never felt like this before," he admitted, his voice barely more than a hoarse whisper. Melino's hand slid to his face, her thumb brushing over his cheekbone as she smiled. "Neither have I," she whispered. Matt's chest squeezed painfully at her words, and he leaned down to kiss her again. This time the kiss was deeper, more desperate. His hands slid down her sides, memorizing the delicate slope of her waist and the soft flare of her hips. Melino's hands slid over his back, her nails grazing his skin as she pressed closer. Matt groaned softly, his mouth trailing down the line of her jaw to her collarbone. His control was slipping fast, the hunger building beneath his skin becoming unbearable. But beneath the raw need was something deeper, something more dangerous. He didn't just want Melino, he needed her, every part of her. Her breath, her touch, her soul. He needed it all. His hands slid beneath the lace slip, his fingers splaying over the curve of her bare back as he pressed closer. Melino gasped softly, her head tilting back as Matt's mouth found the delicate line of her throat. "Melino," he breathed, his voice rough with longing. "I can't stop." Melino's hands slid to his face, guiding his gaze back to hers. "Don't stop," she whispered, her eyes dark with trust and desire. That was all Matt needed. His mouth claimed hers again, the kiss deep and consuming as his hands memorized every inch of her beneath his touch. Melino arched beneath him, her breath hitching as his lips trailed down her throat and across her bare shoulder. His hands slid down her sides, his touch reverent and sure as he learned the delicate lines of her body. He pulled her closer, his mouth finding hers again as his heart pounded painfully in his chest. He had never touched a woman before, but now he knew he would never be able to stop. He was addicted to her warmth, her touch, the soft sound of her breathing beneath him. His hands slid to her face, framing her jaw as he pressed one last, lingering kiss against her lips. When he finally pulled away, Melino's dark eyes were soft and luminous as they met his. "You're mine now," Matt whispered, his voice low and full of quiet possession. Melino's lips curved into a soft smile as she brushed her fingers over his lips. "And you're mine," she whispered back. Matt's heart swelled painfully at her words, and he pulled her closer, his hands splaying over the curve of her waist as he kissed her again. His first touch had been hesitant, but now there was no hesitation left. Melino was his, and he was never letting her go. Matt woke before dawn, the soft light filtering through the sheer curtains, casting a golden glow over the room. His eyes opened slowly, and the first thing he saw was Melino lying beside him, her breathing soft and steady as she slept. Her long braided hair spilled over the white pillow, the pearls woven through her braids catching the early morning light and shimmering like tiny stars. Her smooth brown skin glowed in the faint light, her delicate features relaxed in sleep. His chest squeezed painfully at the sight of her, the soft curve of her bare shoulder peeking out from beneath the thin sheet, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. His hand moved before he even realized it, his fingers brushing tenderly over her cheek. Her skin was warm and impossibly soft beneath his touch, and the simple act of touching her made his pulse quicken. His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone, and he sighed softly, feeling the weight of last night settle heavily in his chest. His lips parted as his gaze swept over her peaceful face, her dark lashes resting against her skin, her full lips slightly parted. His heart hammered painfully against his ribs as he slid his hand down to her jaw, his thumb grazing the soft line of her lower lip. He didn't know how to explain it, but something inside him had shifted last night. He had never known what it felt like to need someone so desperately. Not just her body, but her presence, her warmth, the quiet sound of her breathing next to him. He had lived his entire life behind cold walls, untouched and uninterested in the idea of closeness. But now, lying here with Melino pressed against him, her hand resting lightly over his chest, he felt as though the walls around his heart had shattered. His hand moved from her face to her hand, his fingers sliding through hers and holding them tightly. Melino stirred beneath his touch, her eyes fluttering open slowly. The soft brown depths of her gaze met his, and Matt's heart skipped a beat. A soft smile curved her lips as she stretched slightly, her hand brushing over his bare chest as her gaze softened. "Good morning," she whispered, her voice still heavy with sleep. Matt's throat tightened as his hand tightened around hers. He leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers as his breath mingled with hers in the small space between them. "Melino," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. She smiled softly, her fingers brushing over the line of his jaw. "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft and curious. Matt exhaled shakily, his hand sliding from her jaw down to her neck, his thumb resting against the hollow of her throat where he could feel her pulse fluttering rapidly beneath his touch. His eyes darkened as his gaze swept over her face, memorizing every delicate line, every subtle expression. "I think—" He hesitated, his breath catching as her hand slid up to cup his face. Her touch was so soft, so warm, it made his chest ache. "I think I'm addicted to you," he finally whispered, his voice low and unsteady. Melino's eyes widened slightly before her smile softened. Her fingers slid through his hair as she tilted her head toward him. "Addicted?" she whispered, her voice teasing but gentle. Matt's hand slid down her side, his palm skimming over the curve of her waist beneath the sheet. "Yes," he said, his voice stronger now. His mouth brushed over her forehead, trailing soft kisses down to her temple. "I can't stop touching you. I don't want to stop. It's terrifying how much I want you." Melino's breath hitched as his hand slid over the bare skin of her back, his fingertips tracing the delicate line of her spine. Her arms wrapped around his neck, her body pressing closer to his. "Then don't stop," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. Matt's chest squeezed painfully as his lips pressed against hers, the kiss soft and lingering. His hand slid to the small of her back, pressing her closer as his mouth deepened the kiss. Melino sighed softly into his mouth, her arms tightening around him as their bodies melted together beneath the sheets. When he finally pulled back, his forehead pressed to hers, his dark eyes searching hers with quiet intensity. "Melino," he said softly, "you've changed everything." Melino smiled, her eyes soft and full of quiet affection. "And you've changed me," she whispered back. Matt's breath caught as his hand slid up to her face, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. His gaze darkened as his hand slid back down to her waist. His breathing was heavy now, and his heart thudded painfully against his ribs as he stared at her. "I'm never going to get enough of you," he whispered, his voice dark with quiet desperation. Melino's fingers slid over his chest, her nails grazing his skin as her lips curved into a soft smile. "Then don't try," she whispered. Matt's chest constricted painfully as he leaned down, his mouth finding hers again in a kiss that was both soft and deep. His hand slid up to her neck, his thumb resting against her throat as he swallowed the soft sound she made beneath his touch. He didn't know how this had happened, how he had gone from a man untouched and uninterested to someone who couldn't breathe without her. But he knew there was no going back. He was completely and utterly addicted to her. And the terrifying part was, he didn't want to be saved. His lips trailed down the line of her jaw as he pulled her closer, his breath rough as he whispered, "I'm not letting this go. Ever." Melino's hands slid through his hair as she smiled softly against his lips. "Good," she whispered back. Matt's chest swelled painfully at her words, and his arms tightened around her. He kissed her again, slow and deep, his hands memorizing the feel of her beneath his touch. This wasn't just desire, it was something deeper. He didn't just want Melino. He needed her. Her presence, her warmth, her breath. He had never touched a woman before, but now he knew he would never be able to stop. And the terrifying truth was, he didn't want to. Matt had always been a man of discipline and control, someone who thrived on order and precision. His days were structured down to the minute. Board meetings at 9, business lunches at noon, strategy calls at 3. But ever since Melino had stepped into his life, his carefully constructed world had begun to unravel in the most beautiful way. He found himself distracted during meetings, his mind drifting to the sound of her laugh or the way her eyes sparkled when she smiled. He would sit at his desk, trying to focus on reports and projections, but all he could think about was the way her smooth, brown skin felt beneath his fingertips, the soft weight of her head resting on his chest as they lay tangled together in bed. It wasn't long before Matt began making changes, small ones at first. He started leaving the office early, claiming he had personal matters to attend to, even though his assistant gave him confused glances. He stopped accepting dinner invitations from potential business partners and instead found himself rushing home to catch Melino before she fell asleep. And then, one morning, as he sat in his office, staring blankly at a list of international clients, something inside him shifted. He reached for his phone and canceled his afternoon meetings without hesitation. An hour later, he was standing outside their mansion, clutching a bouquet of fresh roses. Melino opened the door with a curious smile, her long braided hair falling over her shoulder as she leaned against the doorframe. "Matt," she said, her voice light with surprise. He smiled, stepping forward and brushing his thumb over her cheek. "I missed you," he admitted, his voice rough with honesty. Her eyes softened as he handed her the roses. "You canceled your meetings?" she asked, her brows lifting in disbelief. "Yes," Matt said, stepping closer until his body was flush against hers. His arms circled her waist, pulling her close as he breathed in the scent of her hair. "They can wait. You can't." Melino's eyes widened at his words, and then she laughed softly, her fingers brushing over the back of his neck. "I'm starting to think I've ruined you," she teased, her smile soft and teasing. Matt's hand slid to the small of her back as he guided her inside, closing the door behind them. "Maybe," he murmured, "but I don't care." That evening, he surprised her with a candlelit dinner on the terrace. He had arranged everything: white linens, crystal glasses, a personal chef preparing their favorite dishes. Melino sat across from him, the evening breeze stirring her braids as her dark eyes sparkled beneath the soft glow of the lanterns. Matt couldn't stop staring at her. Every time she smiled or tilted her head, a rush of heat filled his chest. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his and brushing his thumb over her knuckles. "I don't think you realize how much you've changed me," he said softly. Melino's eyes softened as she squeezed his hand. "You're not so bad," she teased. He chuckled, his gaze darkening as his hand slid up her wrist. "I'm not sure I was alive before you," he admitted. "Not really." Melino's cheeks flushed as Matt leaned closer, his lips brushing over her knuckles. That night, he carried her to bed, his hands memorizing the feel of her beneath his touch. He whispered her name over and over as his lips moved across her skin, worshiping her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. Because to Matt, she was. The next morning, Matt woke up to find Melino curled up beside him, her hand resting over his chest. He kissed her forehead softly, then slipped out of bed and made a phone call. "Cancel everything today," he told his assistant. "All of it." His assistant sounded confused. "Sir, you have a conference call with the London partners." "Cancel it," Matt interrupted, his voice calm but final. "And book a flight to Bali." "Bali?" the assistant repeated in disbelief. "Yes," Matt said, glancing down at Melino's sleeping form. "For two." 2 days later, they were lounging beneath a thatched cabana on a private beach, the sound of waves crashing against the shore in the background. Melino lay beside him in a white sundress, her braided hair pulled over one shoulder as she sipped from a chilled glass of pineapple juice. Matt lay back, his arm draped over her waist as his hand rested over her stomach. "This is insane," Melino murmured, turning toward him with a sleepy smile. "You have businesses to run." "They'll survive without me," Matt replied, his gaze dark and intense as he brushed his fingers through her hair. "I won't survive without you." Melino's eyes widened slightly before a soft smile curved her lips. She leaned in, pressing a kiss to his chest as her hand slid over his side. Matt's breath hitched as her lips brushed over his skin, and he pulled her closer, his hand threading through her braids as his mouth found hers. They spent the rest of the afternoon wrapped up in each other, tangled beneath the sun-drenched sheets of their beachside villa. When they returned home, Matt's devotion only deepened. He began filling their house with fresh flowers, roses and lilies in shades of white and pink. He would wake Melino with soft kisses and spend hours sitting with her in the sunlit garden, brushing his fingers through her hair as she rested her head on his shoulder. He took her to Paris on a whim, flying her in a private jet to have dinner beneath the Eiffel Tower. He held her hand as they walked through the streets of Santorini, buying her delicate gold bracelets and tucking fresh jasmine into her hair. Every day, Matt's love for her grew deeper, more obsessive. He would watch her across a room, unable to focus on anything else. He found himself craving her touch, her scent, the sound of her voice. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would wake just to press his lips to her shoulder, needing the reassurance of her warmth. "You're spoiling me," Melino whispered one evening as they lay curled together beneath the soft sheets of their bed. Matt's arm tightened around her waist as he brushed his lips over her temple. "No," he murmured. "I'm giving you what you deserve." Melino smiled as her hand slid up his chest, her fingers brushing over his heart. Matt sighed softly, his hand sliding up her back as he buried his face in her hair. He had never known what it meant to love someone this much, to want someone this deeply. He had built his empire alone, convinced that he didn't need anyone. But now, lying here with Malino in his arms, he knew the truth. She was his heart. She was his home. And he would spend the rest of his life making sure she knew it. Matt had always been a man of focus and control, but ever since Malino had entered his life, all that control had dissolved into an unrelenting obsession. His addiction to her grew stronger with each passing day, consuming him in ways he never imagined possible. He couldn't keep his hands off her, physically or emotionally. Every morning, Matt woke before Malino just to watch her sleep. He would lie beside her, his head propped up on one hand, as his other hand traced the soft curve of her bare shoulder. Her smooth brown skin glowed in the soft morning light, and Matt would reach out, brushing his fingers along the line of her collarbone, memorizing the feel of her beneath his touch. He would lean down and press a soft kiss to her temple, inhaling the delicate scent of her skin. And when she stirred, her long braided hair spilling over the pillows, Matt's heart would tighten painfully in his chest. Malino would blink up at him, her wide dark eyes soft with sleep, and smile. That smile destroyed Matt every time. "Morning," she would whisper, her voice husky from sleep. Matt's hand would slide into her hair, his fingers threading through the silky braids as he leaned down to kiss her. His lips would linger on hers, and when he pulled back, his gaze would darken with intensity. "Stay with me today," he would murmur, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. Malino's smile would widen as she stretched beneath him, her arms sliding around his neck. "I have plans," she would tease, her laughter light and playful. But Matt would grow serious, his arms tightening around her as his mouth claimed hers again, more possessive this time. "Cancel them," he would whisper against her lips. "You're more important." And she always was. Matt had started rearranging his entire life around Malino. Business meetings were pushed back or outright canceled. When his board members asked why he was skipping important calls, Matt's answer was always the same. Something more important came up. That something was always Malino. He would take her hand and pull her into his lap while they sat by the pool. His hands would trace slow circles over her thighs as he rested his chin on her shoulder, his mouth brushing over the soft skin of her neck. "You're making me lose my mind," he would whisper, his breath warm against her ear. Malino would laugh, turning her head to brush her lips over his jaw. "Good," she would reply. At night, Matt's obsession became even more overwhelming. He couldn't sleep without her body pressed against his. If Malino shifted away from him in the middle of the night, Matt would wake instantly, his arms tightening around her waist as he pulled her back against his chest. His lips would find her shoulder, trailing kisses up to her neck. "Don't pull away," he would whisper, his voice dark with need. "Stay close." Malino would sigh softly, melting into his embrace. Matt's hands would roam over her body, his fingertips memorizing the soft curves of her waist, the warmth of her skin beneath his touch. His lips would brush over her ear as he whispered, "I don't know what you've done to me, but I can't stop needing you." Malino would turn in his arms, her hands sliding up to cup his face as her lips found his. And when she kissed him, Matt felt like he was unraveling. He would press her beneath him, his mouth trailing over her neck as his hands slid into her hair. "You've ruined me," he would whisper between heated kisses. "I can't think straight. I can't breathe when you're not with me." Malino would smile beneath him, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "You're not so bad yourself," she would tease, her voice soft and loving. But Matt's gaze would grow darker as he leaned down to kiss her again, slower this time, deeper. "I'm not letting you go," he would whisper against her lips. His obsession extended far beyond the bedroom. During the day, Matt would find himself watching her constantly. If they were at a business dinner, his eyes would be fixed on her, ignoring conversations happening around him. Malino would sit beside him, her hand resting lightly on his thigh, and Matt would place his hand over hers, linking their fingers together possessively. If another man so much as glanced in her direction, Matt's expression would darken, and his hand would tighten over hers. "He's looking at you," Matt would murmur into her ear. Melina would smile knowingly, turning toward him. "And?" she would ask. Matt's arm would slide around her waist, his lips brushing over her jawline. "He shouldn't be," Matt would reply darkly, "because you're mine." Melina would laugh softly, turning in his arms and brushing a kiss over his lips. Matt would relax the moment her mouth touched his, the tension in his chest easing as his hand slid up her back. "Better," he would murmur. His obsession for Melina became so overwhelming that he couldn't stand being apart from her, even for a few hours. When Melina mentioned spending the weekend with her friends, Matt's reaction was immediate and intense. "You can't go," he said, his expression tightening. Melina raised an eyebrow, smiling. "Why not?" Matt stepped toward her, his hand sliding into her hair as he leaned down to kiss her. "Because I need you with me," he whispered. "Every second." Melina's gaze softened as her hands slid over his chest. "I'll only be gone for a few hours." "Too long," Matt replied. His mouth covered hers before she could protest, his hands sliding down her back as he pressed her close. "I don't function without you." Melina sighed softly as Matt's lips moved down her neck, his hands gripping her waist. "You're getting worse," she teased. Matt's gaze darkened as he lifted his head, his eyes sharp and burning with intensity. "No," he said quietly. "I'm just realizing how much you mean to me." That night, Matt held her close, his hand pressed over her heart as he listened to the steady sound of her breathing. His lips brushed over her hair as he whispered, "I love you, Melina, and I'm never letting go." When Melina drifted off to sleep, Matt stayed awake, his hand resting over hers. His heart was pounding in his chest as he realized the truth. His obsession for her wasn't just desire or need, it was love. Deep, consuming love that left him breathless and terrified all at once. He couldn't lose her. He wouldn't survive it. And as Matt watched Melina sleep peacefully in his arms, he vowed silently to himself he would do whatever it took to keep her with him forever. Melina had been watching Matt closely for weeks now, noticing the tension in his jaw, the exhaustion etched into his sharp, handsome features, and the distant look in his eyes whenever he returned home from the office late at night. He was overworked and overwhelmed, and no matter how much he tried to hide it behind that stoic mask, Melina could see through him. He had given so much of himself to his business, pushing through endless meetings, mergers, and deals, and she could sense that he was nearing the edge of burnout. She hated seeing him like that, so burdened, so weighed down by the pressure of his own success. That's why she had spent the last week preparing a surprise for him, something that would take the weight off his shoulders, even if just for a little while. That evening, Melina sat in the living room, her heart fluttering nervously as she heard Matt's key turning in the front door. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the hallway, slow and heavy, and when he finally appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened and his shirt slightly rumpled. Her heart clenched at the sight of him. His dark eyes softened the moment he saw her sitting on the couch, wearing a simple satin slip dress that hugged her curves. Her long braids were pulled over one shoulder, and her smooth brown skin glowed under the soft light of the room. "Hey," he said tiredly, dropping his briefcase on the floor as he walked toward her. Melina stood, her hands trembling slightly as she held out the small black box. "I have something for you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Matt's brows furrowed as he looked down at the box. "What's this?" he asked, his tone curious but guarded. Melina bit her lip as he reached for the box and flipped it open. A single silver key rested on the velvet lining inside. Matt's dark eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze lifting to hers. "A key?" he murmured, his tone low and careful. Malino took a shaky breath, her hands twisting together as she whispered, "It's the key to the beach house." His brows lifted, his gaze sharpening with surprise. "The beach house?" Malino nodded, stepping closer. "I bought it last week," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought, you've been working so hard, you need a break. We need a break, just the two of us. I thought we could escape there for a while." Matt's hand tightened around the box as his gaze darkened with an emotion so intense it nearly stole Malino's breath. He reached out, his hand sliding around the back of her neck as he pulled her into his chest. His other hand wrapped around her waist, holding her close as his mouth pressed to her hair. "You did this for me?" he whispered against her ear, his voice rough with disbelief and quiet vulnerability. Malino nodded, her hands sliding up his chest as she whispered, I wanted you to have somewhere to breathe." Matt's chest heaved beneath her palms as his arms tightened around her body, his breath coming out shakily. He pulled back slightly, his dark gaze locking with hers. "Malino," he murmured, his hand sliding up to cup her cheek. His thumb brushed over her lower lip as he leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "You're everything I need," he whispered, his voice rough and raw. "Let's go there tonight." Malino's heart skipped as Matt's mouth crashed against hers, his kiss deep and consuming. His arms slid under her thighs as he lifted her off the ground, carrying her toward the bedroom. Malino gasped as Matt's mouth trailed down her neck, his breath hot against her skin. "Pack a bag," he growled. "We're leaving tonight." Malino's head spun as Matt set her down, his dark eyes burning with intensity as he brushed his thumb over her cheek. "We'll stay there as long as you want," he promised, his voice low and serious. "Just you and me." An hour later, they arrived at the beach house. The moonlight reflected off the calm waves outside the glass windows, casting a soft silver glow over the room. Malino stood in the center of the airy living room, her bare feet sinking into the soft white carpet as she gazed out at the ocean. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore filled the air, and the salty breeze drifted through the open balcony doors. Matt came up behind her, his hands sliding around her waist as he pressed his chest to her back. His lips brushed over her ear as he whispered, "It's perfect." Malino smiled, her heart swelling as she leaned back into him. Matt's hands slid lower, his fingers brushing over her hips as he kissed the curve of her neck. "But you're the best part," he whispered. Malino's breath hitched as Matt turned her around, his dark eyes blazing with desire. He reached up, his fingers threading through her braids as he tilted her head back. "Do you know what you've done to me?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Malino shook her head, her lips parting as Matt's mouth brushed over hers. "You've ruined me," he said, his hands sliding down her back. "I can't think straight. I can't breathe without you." Malino's heart pounded as Matt lifted her into his arms, carrying her toward the large white canopy bed in the center of the room. He laid her down gently, his mouth never leaving hers as his hands slid down her sides. "I need you," he whispered, his voice rough with desperation. "I need all of you." Malino's breath hitched as Matt's hands slid beneath the thin strap of her slip dress, his gaze dark with intensity as he leaned down to kiss her. His lips moved down her neck, over her shoulder, and down to the soft curve of her collarbone. "You're so beautiful," he whispered, his hands roaming over her skin. Malino's fingers curled into Matt's hair as he kissed her deeply, his mouth moving over hers with raw hunger. The sound of the waves outside faded as Matt's hands slid over her body, memorizing every inch of her. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "More than I've ever loved anything in my life." Malino's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "I love you too." Matt's breath hitched as he kissed her again, deeper this time, his hands threading through her braids as his body pressed against hers. The night stretched on endlessly as Matt lost himself in Malino. his need for her growing stronger with every kiss, every breath, every whispered word of love. And when the sun rose the next morning, casting golden light over their tangled bodies, Matt pulled Melino closer, his arms tightening around her as he whispered into her hair, "I'm never leaving this place. I'm never letting you go." Melino smiled sleepily, her hand sliding over his chest as she whispered back, "Good." Melino walked into their bedroom late that night, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting shadows across the walls. The house was quiet, the hum of the ocean breeze drifting in through the open balcony doors, but the weight in the air was heavy, too heavy. She immediately noticed Matt sitting at the edge of the bed, his shoulders hunched forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and his head bowed low. His usually sharp, commanding features were etched with a raw vulnerability she had rarely seen. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and the tension in his body was palpable, radiating off him in waves. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt with the top buttons undone, revealing the strong lines of his collarbone, and his bare feet pressed into the plush white carpet beneath him. Melino's heart clenched at the sight of him, and without hesitation, she crossed the room and knelt in front of him. "Matt," she whispered softly, her hand brushing over his knee. He didn't respond at first, his dark eyes trained on the floor, his expression closed off and distant. But Melino could feel the storm brewing beneath the surface, the turmoil in his chest that he was trying so hard to contain. "What's wrong?" she asked gently, her voice soft and steady as she reached up to touch his face. Matt's jaw tightened beneath her palm, and for a moment she thought he might pull away. But then he let out a slow, shaky breath and lifted his gaze to hers. His dark eyes were clouded with emotion, shadows flickering across the depths of them. He hesitated, his hand sliding over hers, his thumb brushing against her delicate skin as though he was grounding himself in her touch. "I've always been alone," he murmured, his voice low and rough. His eyes dropped again, his hand tightening over hers. "For as long as I can remember, it's just been me." Melino's chest ached at the quiet confession, the vulnerability in his tone cutting straight through her heart. She knew Matt's life hadn't been easy. He had built his empire from nothing, clawing his way to the top with relentless determination. But the cost had been high. He had shielded himself from the world, trusting no one, relying on no one. He had learned to be self-sufficient, to keep his heart guarded and untouchable. But now, sitting before her with his hands trembling slightly as they curled over hers, Melino could see the cracks in that armor. "But you..." Matt's voice was strained as he lifted his gaze back to hers. His hand slid up her arm, his fingers brushing against her skin as he whispered, "You make me feel like I'm enough." Melino's breath hitched, tears filling her eyes as she watched the fierce vulnerability in his expression. His gaze was raw, stripped bare of all the stoicism and control he usually wore like a shield. He was letting her in, completely, fully. She reached up, her hands framing his face as her thumbs brushed over the sharp lines of his jaw. "You are enough," she whispered fiercely, her voice thick with emotion. Matt's breath shuddered out of him as his eyes closed briefly beneath the weight of her words. When his eyes opened again, they were dark and intense, burning with something deeper than desire, something raw and unbreakable. His hands slid around her waist, pulling her onto his lap as his mouth captured hers in a fierce, desperate kiss. Melino gasped against his lips, her hands sliding into his hair as Matt's arms tightened around her. He kissed her as though he was unraveling, his need for her pouring through every stroke of his tongue, every rough, hungry press of his mouth. His hands slid beneath her satin nightgown, his fingers brushing over her soft skin as he pulled her closer, their bodies molding together. "You saved me," he whispered against her lips. Melino shook her head, her forehead resting against his as she whispered, "No, Matt. You saved yourself. But I'm here. I'm here with you." Matt's breath was ragged as his arms tightened around her, his mouth brushing over her cheek, her jaw the curve of her neck. "Don't leave me," he breathed, his voice raw and broken. Malino's heart fractured at the sound of it. "Never," she promised, her fingers threading through his hair as she kissed him again. "I'll never leave you." Matt's hands slid up her back, his fingers threading through the long braids that cascaded down her back as he kissed her with bruising intensity. His mouth moved over hers like he was trying to imprint himself into her soul to make sure she knew, without a doubt, that she was everything to him. "I don't know how to live without you," he confessed against her lips. Malino's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "You'll never have to." Matt's breath caught as he kissed her again, his hands sliding up her back as he pulled her down onto the bed with him. His body pressed against hers, his heart thundering beneath her palm as he buried his face against her neck. "Malino," he whispered, his voice breaking. Malino held him, her arms wrapped around his shoulders as her hands slid over the strong lines of his back. "I've got you," she whispered. "Always." Matt's breath shuddered out of him as his arms tightened around her, his body trembling against hers. They lay there in the dark, the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shore, filling the silence around them. Malino pressed her lips to his forehead, her hands threading through his hair as she whispered quiet reassurances into his ear. Slowly, Matt's breathing steadied, his body relaxing beneath her touch. His hands slid down her back, his fingers curling around her waist as he pressed his lips to her shoulder. "I love you," he whispered. Malino's heart swelled as she whispered back, "I love you too." Matt's eyes darkened as he rolled her beneath him, his mouth capturing hers again in a slow, lingering kiss. His hands slid over her sides, memorizing every inch of her as he whispered her name like a prayer. "You're everything to me," he murmured. "You're all I need." Malino's eyes filled with tears as Matt's mouth trailed down her neck, over her shoulder, his hands sliding beneath the thin straps of her nightgown. Their breathing quickened, their bodies tangling beneath the sheets as Matt's mouth moved over her skin with desperate reverence. Malino's fingers curled into his hair as her back arched beneath his touch. "Matt," she gasped, her voice breaking. He lifted his head, his dark eyes burning with fierce intensity as he whispered, "You're mine, Malino." Malino's heart thundered beneath her ribs as she cupped his face, her thumbs brushing over his cheekbones as she whispered, "And you're mine." Matt's breath hitched as he kissed her again, his mouth moving over hers with unrelenting hunger. They lost themselves in each other that night, their bodies intertwined beneath the moonlight filtering through the glass windows. And when morning came, Matt woke to find Malino still wrapped in his arms, her face pressed against his chest. He brushed his lips over her forehead as he whispered, "Forever." Malino's lips curled into a soft smile as she whispered sleepily, "Forever." Matt woke to the soft sound of Malino's steady breathing, the early morning light filtering through the sheer white curtains that fluttered gently in the ocean breeze. His eyes blinked open slowly, adjusting to the golden glow that bathed their bedroom in warmth. But his gaze wasn't drawn to the sunrise or the soft sounds of the waves beyond the open balcony doors. It was fixed on Malino lying beside him, her dark lashes fanned against her smooth cheeks, her full lips parted slightly as she breathed softly in sleep. Her long braids spilled across the pillow, and the thin strap of her satin nightgown had slipped down her shoulder, exposing the smooth curve of her collarbone and the gentle rise and fall of her chest beneath the delicate fabric. Matt's heart clenched at the sight of her, the overwhelming tenderness swelling in his chest, making it hard to breathe. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as his fingertips brushed down her bare arm. Her skin was warm beneath his touch, and he watched as a shiver ran through her body even in sleep. His hand moved slowly, reverently, tracing the soft curve of her shoulder, down the slender line of her arm until his fingers intertwined with hers. Malino stirred slightly, a soft sigh escaping her lips as her hand curled around his. Matt's breath hitched as he leaned closer, his lips brushing over her temple. He stayed there for a long moment, his mouth pressed against her skin as he breathed her in, warm and sweet, like jasmine and honey. His fingers moved slowly down her arm, his thumb brushing over the delicate line of her wrist, feeling the steady pulse beneath her skin. His heart hammered painfully in his chest as he realized how fragile she was and how much he needed her. His other hand slid up to her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone as he whispered, "Malino." Her lashes fluttered, her eyes slowly opening to meet his. The deep brown of her gaze was still hazy from sleep, but the moment she saw him, her lips curled into a soft, drowsy smile. "Matt," she whispered, her voice husky and sweet. Matt's heart ached at the sound of it, at the way her smile made his entire world tilt on its axis. He leaned down, his lips brushing over hers in a soft, lingering kiss. Malino's hand slid into his hair, her fingers threading through the dark strands as she pulled him closer. "What are you doing awake so early?" she murmured against his lips. Matt smiled faintly, his mouth moving over her cheek and down the curve of her neck. "I couldn't sleep," he whispered. "I wanted to watch you." Malino's cheeks flushed as her hand slid down his back, her palm resting over his heart. "You're staring at me in my sleep now?" she teased, her eyes shining with quiet amusement. Matt's gaze darkened as he cupped her face in his hands. "I can't help it," he murmured. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Malino's breath hitched as Matt's lips brushed over her forehead, down her cheek, and then back to her mouth. He kissed her slowly, deeply, his hands sliding over her back as he pulled her closer. Their bodies molded together beneath the sheets, and Matt could feel the soft warmth of her skin beneath his fingertips. "Every time I wake up next to you," he whispered against her lips, "I feel like I'm dreaming." Malino's heart fluttered painfully at the tenderness in his voice, her eyes filling with warmth as her arms tightened around him. Matt's hand slid up to the back of her neck, his thumb brushing over her pulse as he kissed her again, his mouth deepening over hers with quiet desperation. "I don't know how I lived before you," he admitted, his voice rough and unsteady. "And I never want to live without you." Malino's chest squeezed painfully as she kissed him back, her lips trembling beneath his. "You don't have to," she whispered. Matt's eyes burned as his forehead pressed against hers. "You're everything to me," he breathed. "Everything." Malino's hands slid up to cup his face, her thumbs brushing over his jawline as her lips curved into a soft smile. "And you're everything to me," she whispered back. Matt's arms tightened around her, pulling her beneath him as his mouth moved over hers with fierce tenderness. Their breaths mingled, their hands exploring each other's bodies with quiet reverence as the morning light spilled over them in golden waves. Matt's hand slid beneath the thin strap of her nightgown, pushing it down her shoulder as his lips followed the path of his hand. Malino gasped softly, her back arching beneath his touch as his mouth moved down her neck, over the delicate line of her collarbone. "Matt," she whispered, her hands curling into his hair. He lifted his head, his dark eyes burning with intensity as he whispered, "I love you." Malino's eyes softened, her hand brushing over his cheek as she whispered, "I love you too." Matt's breath hitched as his mouth covered hers again, his hands sliding down her sides as he memorized every inch of her body beneath his touch. He kissed her until her breaths turned shallow, until her hands were trembling against his skin, until the world outside melted away completely. "Stay with me," he whispered against her lips. "Always," Malino breathed, her arms tightening around his neck. Matt's mouth moved over hers in a slow, lingering kiss, his hands sliding beneath the sheet to wrap around her waist as he pulled her closer. They lay tangled together beneath the soft morning light, their hearts beating in perfect rhythm as their bodies molded into each other. Matt's hands moved slowly over her back, his fingers tracing the delicate curve of her spine as his lips brushed over her temple. "Forever," he whispered. Melino's lips curled into a soft smile as she whispered back, "Forever." Matt held her until her breathing slowed again, his hand resting over her heart as he closed his eyes. And as sleep pulled her back under, Matt lay awake, his arms wrapped protectively around her as the golden light of morning bathed them both in warmth. He knew then, without a doubt, that he had already found everything he would ever need. In her. The storm hit hard and fast, tearing through Matt's carefully constructed world with brutal force. The business scandal erupted overnight, plastered across every headline, dominating every news outlet. Accusations of fraud, betrayal within his company, and mismanaged funds were hurled at him with merciless intensity. Paparazzi crowded the gates of their mansion, reporters screaming questions and flashing cameras in his face whenever he tried to leave. Investors pulled back, stocks plummeted, and his board members started circling like vultures, questioning his leadership and integrity. Matt had faced pressure before. He had built his empire from nothing and fought through countless storms, but this time it was different. This time the accusations cut too deep, the betrayal coming from people he had trusted for years. He was drowning under the weight of it, every phone call bringing more bad news, every news report shredding what was left of his carefully built reputation. He barely slept, spending endless hours on the phone with his legal team, trying to contain the damage. His once confident demeanor cracked with the strain, and beneath the surface, fear coiled tightly in his chest. He sat in his office, his head in his hands, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. The knock on the door was soft, hesitant, but he already knew who it was. Melino stepped inside, her delicate frame framed by the dim light. She wore a fitted black dress, her long braids falling over her bare shoulders, her brown skin glowing with quiet strength. She crossed the room without a word, sinking down beside him on the leather sofa. Her hand slid into his, her fingers lacing through his tense ones. Matt didn't lift his head. He couldn't. He didn't want her to see how broken he was. But Melino's touch was gentle, her thumb brushing over the back of his hand as she whispered, "Matt, look at me." His breath hitched. Slowly, reluctantly, he lifted his head. His dark eyes met hers, stormy and bloodshot with exhaustion. "I'm losing everything," he said, his voice rough and hollow. Melino's gaze softened as she brushed her fingers through his hair, her touch soothing the sharp edges of his pain. "You're not losing me," she whispered. Matt's throat tightened painfully as she cupped his face in her hands. "You don't have to go through this alone," she said. "I'm with you, no matter what." He shook his head, his jaw clenching. "You don't understand," he rasped. "If this gets worse, they'll come after me. I could lose the company. I could lose everything I've built." Melino's eyes darkened with quiet resolve. "Let them take it," she said fiercely. "Let them take everything. I don't care about the money, the company, the empire. All I care about is you." Matt's breath hitched, his chest tightening painfully. His hands slid up to her wrists, holding her there as his eyes burned. "Melino, I love you," she said, her voice breaking. "You are enough. Even if you lose everything, you will still be enough for me." A harsh sound escaped his throat, part pain, part relief. His walls crumbled completely as he pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her neck. His chest heaved as the weight of the pressure, the fear, and the vulnerability broke free all at once. "I'm nothing without you," he whispered hoarsely against her skin. Melino's hands slid up his back, her fingers threading into his hair as she held him tightly. "You are everything," she whispered back. "Everything." Matt's hands shook as he pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. His heart hammered wildly as his hands framed her face, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones. "Stay with me," he whispered. Melino smiled softly through her tears. "Always." He kissed her fiercely then, his mouth crashing against hers with a raw desperation that left them both breathless. His hands slid into her hair, holding her head still as he kissed her deeper, pouring every ounce of fear, love, and need into that kiss. Melino moaned softly against his mouth, her arms tightening around his neck as he lifted her into his lap. Matt's hands slid down her back, gripping her waist as he kissed her with reckless abandon. His breath was ragged as he pulled her closer, her body molding perfectly against his. He stood, carrying her toward the bedroom without breaking the kiss. Melino's hands slid beneath his shirt, her fingers tracing the hard lines of his back as he laid her down on the bed. He stripped his shirt over his head, his dark eyes burning as he looked down at her. Melino's breath hitched as he lowered himself over her, his hands bracing on either side of her head. "Melino." His voice was rough with emotion. Her hands slid up to his face, her fingers brushing over his jawline as she whispered, "I'm here." Matt's chest ached with the intensity of it, with how much he needed her, how much he loved her. He kissed her again, his mouth moving over hers slowly, reverently. His hands slid down her sides, memorizing the feel of her beneath his fingertips. Melino's breath shuddered as he kissed down her neck, over the curve of her shoulder. Her hands trembled as she slid them down his back, her breath hitching as his mouth claimed hers again. "You're everything," he whispered hoarsely against her lips. "Everything." Melino's arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him down until there was no space left between them. His body pressed against hers, his hands sliding beneath the thin fabric of her dress as he touched her with quiet reverence. Melino's breath hitched as his lips brushed over her jawline, down the curve of her neck. "Matt," she whispered. His name was a broken sound on her lips. His mouth found hers again, his hands gripping her waist as he lost himself in her completely. Their bodies moved together beneath the soft light of the room, their breaths mingling, their hearts racing in perfect rhythm. Matt's hand slid into her hair, his mouth capturing hers as his other hand slid down her back. Melino's head tilted back, a soft moan escaping her lips as Matt's mouth moved down the column of her throat. He kissed her slowly, deeply, savoring the taste of her. His breath hitched as her hands slid down his chest, her touch igniting every nerve in his body. "Melino," he whispered, his forehead pressing against hers. "I love you." Melino's eyes softened as her hands cupped his face. "I love you too." He kissed her then with raw tenderness, his hands tangling in her hair as he pulled her closer. Their bodies molded together beneath the sheets, their breathing shallow and ragged as they lost themselves in each other completely. When it was over, Matt held her tightly against his chest, his hand stroking down her back as her head rested over his heart. Melino's hand slid over his chest, her fingers tracing the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I've got you," she whispered. Matt's hand tightened around her waist as he kissed her temple. "Forever," he whispered. Melino smiled softly as her hand slid up to his face. "Forever," she whispered back. Matt's arms tightened around her as they drifted into sleep, tangled together beneath the soft glow of moonlight. And as Matt's breathing evened out, his heart calmed for the first time in weeks. Because for the first time, he knew that no matter what happened, no matter how hard the world tried to tear him down, Melino would always be there, holding him together. Months had passed since Matt and Melino had weathered the storm together, and now they lay entwined beneath the soft glow of the morning light filtering through the sheer white curtains of their bedroom. The air was warm and still, the quiet hum of the city below muffled by the luxury of their penthouse suite. Matt's arm was wrapped possessively around Melino's waist, his hand resting just above the curve of her hip as her head rested on his bare chest. His heartbeat was steady beneath her ear, the comforting sound lulling her into a peaceful haze. His other hand was tangled in her long braids, his fingers gently stroking through the silky strands as he gazed down at her with quiet intensity. Malino's slender fingers traced lazy circles over his chest, her skin glowing beneath the morning light. The white silk sheets were pooled low around their hips, their legs tangled together beneath the warmth of the covers. Matt's dark eyes softened as he tilted her chin upward, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Marrying you was the best decision of my life," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Malino's breath hitched as her eyes softened. Her heart swelled at the raw sincerity in his gaze, at the quiet vulnerability that he showed only to her. "Matt." Her voice was soft, barely a breath against the stillness of the room. Matt's hand slid up her back, his palm pressing flat between her shoulder blades as he pulled her closer, their bare skin pressed flush together. His lips brushed over her forehead, down her temple, and finally over the soft curve of her cheek. Malino's breath caught as his mouth found hers, the kiss slow and deep, filled with quiet reverence. His hand slid down her spine, his fingers splaying over the small of her back as he deepened the kiss. Malino's hands slid up his chest, her arms wrapping around his neck as she melted into him completely. Matt's breath was ragged as he broke the kiss, his forehead pressing against hers as his eyes darkened with quiet intensity. "I'm never letting you go," he whispered, his voice rough with possession. Malino's lips curled into a soft smile as she brushed her fingers down his jawline. "You don't have to," she whispered back. Matt's eyes darkened as he kissed her again, his mouth moving over hers with slow, deliberate intensity. His hand slid into her hair, tugging her head back as he kissed down the column of her throat. Malino's breath hitched as her nails dug into his shoulders, her body arching into him instinctively. Matt's hands slid beneath the sheet, his touch gliding over the soft curve of her hip as he pressed her closer beneath him. "You're mine," he growled against her skin. "Forever." Malino's heart thundered wildly as his lips trailed down her throat, over the delicate curve of her collarbone. "Yours," she whispered breathlessly. Matt's mouth claimed hers again, his hands framing her face as he kissed her deeply, possessively. His breath was rough as he pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "I'm never going to stop wanting you," he admitted hoarsely. "I'll never get enough of you." Malino's eyes softened as her hands slid up to cradle his face. "Then don't stop," she whispered. Matt's lips parted on a shaky breath as his eyes burned with quiet intensity. His hands slid down her sides, his thumbs brushing over the soft curve of her waist as he kissed her again, his mouth moving over hers with aching tenderness. Malino's breath shuddered as his hands explored her body with quiet reverence, his touch memorizing every inch of her skin. "You're everything," Matt whispered hoarsely. "You're my everything." Malino's eyes filled with quiet tears as her arms wrapped around his neck. "And you're mine." Matt's breath hitched as his forehead pressed against hers, his eyes dark with emotion. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. Malino smiled softly as her hands cupped his face. "Yes, you do," she whispered back. "You always have." Matt's chest tightened painfully at the quiet sincerity in her voice. His arms tightened around her, his breath rough against her cheek. "I love you," he whispered. Malino's eyes softened as her fingers brushed over his cheekbone. "I love you too." Matt's breath shuddered as he kissed her again, his hands sliding beneath the sheet as he pulled her body against his. Their breathing mingled as they lost themselves in each other completely, the connection between them deepening with every kiss, every touch, every quiet gasp of pleasure. When it was over, Matt held her tightly against his chest, his hand sliding through her hair as her head rested over his heart. Malino's breath was soft and even, her hand splayed over his chest as her fingers traced the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I'll never let you go," Matt whispered against her hair. Malino smiled as her hand slid up to his face. "Forever," she whispered back. Matt's arms tightened around her as his eyes softened. Forever, he echoed. He kissed her forehead, his hand sliding down her back as he held her close. They lay together in the quiet of the morning light, their bodies entwined beneath the soft glow of the sun. Matt's heart swelled with quiet peace as he watched Melino's eyes flutter closed, her breathing soft and even against his chest. He brushed his lips over her forehead, his hand stroking down her back as he whispered, "Sleep, baby. I've got you." Melino's lips curled into a soft smile as her body relaxed against his. Matt's eyes softened as he watched her drift into sleep, her hand still resting over his heart. His arms tightened around her as his breath evened out, his heart calm and steady beneath her touch. And as sleep pulled him under, Matt knew with quiet certainty that this was everything. That no matter what storms came, no matter what trials they faced, Melino would always be his anchor, his peace, his heart, his everything, forever.